Dear participants, good morning, both to those present in the room and to our listeners online. We are sorry for this little delay in starting. My name is Kršljanin. I'm an assistant professor of Serbian legal history, and this here is our assistant Una Divac, who teaches comparative legal traditions. As you know by the schedule, Professor Vojislav Stanimirovic was also supposed to hold this course with us, but unfortunately, due to some health issues, he is unable to be with us today. Those who are students at the Belgrade Faculty of Law know what a pity that is, how funny Voja can be, what a good expert he is, but we'll try to hold the course so that he has no complaints when he sees the recording afterwards. So since our subject for today are gender issues in comparative legal history, that is, of course, a huge subject. We have to cover everything from Antiquity until yesterday. What's today you're listening in the positive law courses. Okay, I'll presume that was an accident. Feel free to interrupt us with questions if you have any, so you don't have to wait for discussions in the end. Just raise your hand or type in the chat or raise your physical hand for those here. Given the scope of the course, naturally we'll give some broad strokes along with some interesting examples, but feel free to direct us to subjects that you find interesting. And given both the scope of the course and our research preferences, we'll be focusing, let's say, on the Western world, so Europe, some Near East, and the Americas. We won't be going into the Far East, Africa, and so on, although those are, without a doubt, very interesting subjects to research as well. Given the length of the course, we simply can't cover everything. So we are starting with the gender issues in ancient legal history, and I'm giving the floor to Una.
So, hello everyone and good morning. So, let's start this long journey from the prehistoric times and primitive societies. Now, that's a lot of things to talk about and discuss. I'm sorry, I'm trying to divide my attention to both sides. So let's start with this thought from a sociologist, Berger, who said, and I will paraphrase roughly, society was created by humans, but the humans in return are also created by the society. So you cannot talk about existence and creation and development of humans and humankind without talking about creation and development of society. And same when we're talking about gender and gender roles, you cannot talk about them without also reflecting on family, creation of family, development of family, etc. So when did the first family came into existence? Well, no one knows the exact precise time when that happened. It happened a long time ago, but I have ran across some very, I'd like to say, endearing information and findings in archaeology. So in New Mexico, archaeologists found a set of footprints that date back to 10,000 years before Christ. And it was a set of footprints from a young woman or a young man carrying a toddler on their hip and alternating from carrying the toddler from left to right. They could see that because the depth of the footprints changed occasionally. And also in the same region, they found a set of 400 footprints of grown adults and with children. And even older ones were found in England that date back to 800,000 years ago. A group of 5 adults with children. So a family has existed for an extremely long time, and the development of family has been long and tedious. And an important person we have to mention, we're talking about development and evolution of families, of course, a lawyer and ethnologist, Lewis Morgan, who is famous for his revolutionary work called Ancient Society, in which he did 2 important things. He first divided this earliest history of humankind into three separate periods. So period of savagery, period of barbarism, and then period of civilization. And within those three, well, two, he focused mostly on savagery and barbarism. He divided those periods into three stages, lower, middle, and higher, and then researched the development of family and gender roles within it. And also, he was the first one to propose the concept that the earliest human domestic institution was matrilineal clan and not the patriarchal family. So, just a short reflection on his findings. We don't have a lot of time to go in depth. I'm just gonna focus on most important, more interesting part of his findings. So, what divides savagery from barbarism and then from civilization? The use of tools by humans. So savagery is defined by humans using fire, bow and arrow, and pottery. Barbarism is domesticating animals, development of agriculture, metalworking, and then civilization is when the alphabet was first introduced, and again, the development of writing system. So that's when the earliest period of human history ends. The first moment where there is any kind of evidence of existence of a family was middle stages of savagery, where we had the consanguine family of blood relatives, where basically we had endogamy and polygamy, meaning that the spouses were found within the same community of blood relatives, so incest was widespread. And at that stage, the kinship was traced through the mothers, so you have matrilineality. The easiest way to remember it, as long as you have polygamy, you have matrilineality, because when you have a polygamy, the only certain parent was mother. They did not have DNA analysis at that time, so you have matrilineality for quite a long time. And then in higher stage, there is another interesting moment where we have the Punaluan family. We have a shift towards exogamy. So we have brothers from one family, from one community, marrying collectively sisters from another community. Exogamy means that the spouse or spouses, in this case, are sought out in another different community. So here we see an important role women had in prehistoric times and onwards, of course, even later. They were used as this connective tissue between the families, between the communities. They were important for building alliances, for diplomatic relations or embassies, if we can call it like that. I'm going to jump straight next to the middle stage of barbarism, which is a very important point where everything goes downhill for women. So that's the moment where we have the patriarchal family, and there is a shift towards monogamy. And as soon as we had shift towards monogamy, we have patrilineality. So kinship is traced through the father. Now, why I say unfortunately for women, this shift came with worsening the position of women. The patriarchal families very typically consisted of several generations. So we have a multi-generational family living under one roof. We have the eldest man in charge of the family. He's making all the economic, social, and moral decisions for his family members. Women are submitted to men in this situation. A strict monogamy is expected from them. On the other hand, there is not a rule for strict monogamy for men. They can have concubines, other women. They bought women, gained them through kidnapping, etc., etc. And typical examples of this worsening of the position of women in this time was existence of levirate and sororate marriages. Now, does anyone know what are those two types of marriages? I'm just asking like a question.
Well, I'm not sure which one is which, but one is when the husband dies, the wife is transferred to his brother, and the other is, I guess, when the wife dies, he takes the sister of his.
Yes, the first one is levirate marriage, and the second one is sororate marriage. So a woman sort of like is passed along the closest male kin.
And if I just may add briefly that Morgan also has something that's not in this table, but that might also be relevant. What other inventions or stages of technical development are related to those various stages. Una mentioned the fire, bow and arrow and everything for savagery, but the point is that in the middle stage of barbarism, we already have sedential life. We already have the use of metal tools and weapons, and all that agriculture and increased means of effectively both tilling land and waging war puts a focus on male physical strength as something necessary for the survival of the family. Back when people were hunter-gatherers, it was easier for a relative equality to exist between the sexes because there were similar lines of work that both men and women did. Naturally, we may safely assume that it was more the women who were taking care of babies and very little children, etc. But the things that they did in order for the family to survive were more on an even level. And now this change in lifestyle accentuates the part of work that men do as more important. And now we could say that it's a chicken and egg thing, whether that affects the family more or the family affects that.
I just saw a message that they don't hear us.
I think, do you not hear us or Ljubisav can't?
And a lot of people wrote that they cannot.
Okay, well, let me...
They say now it's fixed.
Okay.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear us now? Yes. Maybe you could not hear when Sofia was speaking from the audience, because in this room, unfortunately, we don't have microphones from the audience. So maybe when someone speaks from the audience, we'll ask you to either come closer or to shout so people online could hear you.
Okay. Just a second to see. I think we covered mostly everything in basics.
Yes.
It's just that the golden age of matriarchy, is it a fact or myth? Well, not much to add to that. I think it's a very controversial topic in literature. There are some who do believe that there was this golden rule of the golden matriarchy period where matriarchy was everywhere in the world. And then there are those scientists who say that's feminists' wishful thinking, how they call it. I think that without doubt there were communities, and I think there are still today, that have matriarchy. But to say that it was a universal rule, I think that's very a big claim to make. So let's just leave it at that. So the next, ancient Mesopotamia, the land of cuneiform law. So what to say about Mesopotamia? It's very difficult to make some general claims because Mesopotamia was consisted of several different civilizations that differed in their approach to law and humanity and differed in a strictness and severeness of their penalties. So it's one thing to talk about Sumer, and then completely different to talk about Assyria, especially in the middle and late Assyria. That was a very wild time to be a woman. But let's say there are some things that are common for the whole Mesopotamia. One thing that we can notice when we look at the law codes and when we look at the prologues, introductions where they're preserved, all lawmakers of Mesopotamia present themselves as these just and righteous rulers who were ordained by the gods to create the law and spread the gods' justice on the earth. And the lawmakers, rulers, saw themselves as protectors of justice, and they wanted to treat everyone equally, offer protection to everyone equally, and especially protect those who were, let's say, how do you say that? Ugrožene kategorije. I can't. I forgot the word in English. Yes, risk categories of society who are at risk, like orphans or widows, etc., etc. But when you open those law codes, you actually see two major points of discrimination in them. First of all, we have a completely different treatment of men and women. And then in the introduction, the ruler said, "I want to treat everyone equally." And then you have this huge discrimination between men and women, where men were favored. And then you have this discrimination between free and the enslaved, when you actually read the law code and its articles, you can see that the law codes were written for free people, not the slaves. And this is something that can be said for all the later civilizations as well, not only in the Antiquity, but also in the Middle Ages. There is a difference between experience of women in the upper classes and the lower classes, the big difference. So let me start from, rights of women in Mesopotamia. So in general, one general conclusion, women did have legal capacity in Mesopotamia, but it was limited to a point. And again, it depended on the civilization we were talking about. Sumer valued their women a bit more than the rest of the Near East. And it was a bit much milder law code and civilization for women. There were instances of women, especially in upper classes, that were very well educated, that gained a lot of wealth, that had a very prominent role in society, also in foreign policy, diplomacy, etc. Generally, for Mesopotamia, women could be seen in the market, so they were allowed to work, to have professions, various professions, from scribes to dancers to singers to tavern keepers, weavers, millers, etc., etc. So they could earn their living and they could own property. Now, the ability to be owners was in a way limited, of course. Mostly the property they could own was movable property, wealth, money, etc., etc. When it came to immovable property, that was usually owned by men, with some exceptions. Which were those exceptions? A woman could inherit from her father in case that her father dedicated her to the temple. In other ways, she was surrendered to the temple to perform sacred prostitution. In that instance, she could inherit from her father, but only 3 times less than her brother. So there was no equality there at all. On the other hand, women could gain property usually they gained them through various marital giftings, such as premarital gift, dowry, marital gift, and donatio mortis causa, in case we don't have lawyers present. So that's basically a gift that usually a husband makes towards his wife or his most beloved son in Babylon. So when the husband dies, at that moment, the wife gets the gift or the beloved son. So those are the only examples where women got the property. And of course, women could conclude contracts and they could go to court regarding their property, etc., etc. Now, the field where we see that there is a huge mistreatment of women in Mesopotamia is, of course, marital law, family law, and, well, we saw already inheritance law. To cut it short, women were not allowed to divorce their husbands. Now, in Babylon law, in Hammurabi law code, there were some exceptions when divorce by woman was allowed, but she had to really prove that that she has just causes for divorce. If the cause was not just, she would be thrown in the river and she would be drowned. On the other hand, the man could simply divorce his wife, no reasons given, just send her away with her dowry, and that's it. Women's morality, when it came to sexuality, was very harshly treated in Mesopotamia, meaning that women were held to a higher standard than men. And I'll just give you an example of an article from Ur-Nammu law code, which kind of reflects the whole mentality of Mesopotamia from that time. So we have, I'm going to paraphrase it, of course. We have one article that says, if a man damages the right of another man by taking the virginity of his virgin wife, that man will be killed. And then you have another article that says, if a man damages the right of another man and takes the virginity of his virgin slave, he will have to pay a certain amount of money. Now, first you see the different treatment of women regarding to their class. In first case, there is death punishment, and this here, he just has to pay. But like the phrasing is bizarre. I mean, it's not bizarre for that time. It's bizarre when you look at it right now. He's not being punished for hurting a woman. He's not being punished for assaulting a woman, damaging her mentally and hurting her physically. He is punished because he damaged the right of another man. And that sums up the view of women that there existed in Mesopotamia. They were property of their men, properties of their husbands or their fathers. And the extreme version of it you can see in the Syrian law code. And we're going to reach that law code. And oh my God. Also, women were not, as I said, they're very...
Sorry, but
yes,
can I add another article from Ornamo to... And then 2 articles later you have, but if a young woman comes and seduces another man, not her husband, she is to be killed and the man is free. So in this case, she is the perpetrator, she is the evil seductress who imposed herself on the poor other man. He had nothing to do with it, he simply could not resist, etc. And again, she is the one who is punished due to the infidelity to her husband or even betrothed. And generally, in ancient societies, we have that double standard because of what Una previously mentioned. There is no strictly reliable way of determining fatherhood, of determining who is the father of a child. So if a woman commits adultery, that raises into question who is the father of her children, and maybe the husband is forced to raise another man's children, etc., and that is seen as a big problem. If a man commits adultery while he plants some children somewhere to some other woman, his family is not damaged by that, so that is not a problem. We're simplifying it, of course, but generally that was the idea. Of course, there were people who thought from a moral point of view that it was also wrong for a man to cheat on his wife, etc., but that was not punished by the law. A woman's adultery was, and very frequently by death.
And I would also like to, the article Nina mentioned about the woman seducing the man. Those are actually, it's very interesting. It's a very conflicting view of women they had at that point in time. Women were seen as less than men. They were less intelligent, less capable, less worthy. They were plain, they were easily tempted, easily corrupted. They cannot resist their urges, their temptations, etc., etc. And that's why men are better than women. But at the same time, they were, in such a weird way, afraid of women, and they were giving them some magical properties. Like the example Nina gave, like this woman who is less intelligent, less strong, less worthy, she seduced this huge and smart man, and he could not resist her temptation. So there's constantly this motive of women bewitching men and morally degrading them in a sort of way, corrupting them. Let's use that phrase. So it's not surprising that witchcraft was severely punished in Mesopotamia and also in later Near Eastern societies. In law codes, we also saw articles that deal with false accusations of women, which kind of shows that there were a lot of false accusations of women, usually for witchcraft and adultery. No surprise in that.
But the lawmakers were also aware that there were jealous husbands. There's an interesting distinction in Hammurabi's code. If a man, a husband, accuses his own wife of adultery, she is to take a sacred oath to say that no, she did not cheat on him, and then she will be free. You know generally of the importance of oaths in ancient societies, so it was considered that the gods were watching and would punish someone who transgressed their oath. But the code afterwards says if people were pointing their fingers at a woman saying she was cheated on her husband, then she can't simply give an oath. She has to be thrown in the water as an ordeal. So whether she sinks or not determines whether she is innocent or not. And different cultures had different rules there, but that's not their subject. So she can prove her innocence more easily if it's just her husband accusing her, because husbands could be jealous. But if there's a lot of other people, and let's not forget that ancient Mesopotamia is a very urban culture, so everyone lives nearby. It's not some village homestead and the next neighbor is 10 kilometers away. It's houses in the city. So if everyone around her is talking about her probably seeing some other man, then there might be something more to it than just a jealous husband, and she has to undertake a more serious means of proving her innocence.
Just like to add some facts about Assyria, as I mentioned. So early Assyria was a bit more pleasant place for a woman to be. It really did not differentiate that much in treatment of women from other Mesopotamian civilizations. But then in middle and late Assyria, there was this whole 180 degrees twist, and women completely lost the legal capacity. And I think that's the set of most brutal laws that I've actually ever read, old laws. Such horrible treatment of women. For example, if a woman was raped and there were no witnesses, it would be considered as an adultery and the woman would be murdered. Then again, they had this practice of forced marriages to the rapists. So the daughter was fully and completely possessed by her father. He could literally sell her if he wanted to. So in cases she was raped, the father could decide to marry her off to her rapist to restore the honor. And then you have...
I just had that, but I know what you're going towards.
And then we have also a bizarre solution where actually you see that women often suffered because misdoings of men. So if a man raped another woman, her father did not want to marry her off, he could require, justice, and justice was talion. So as punishment, the rapist's wife or daughter or mother would be raped. So another innocent woman getting hurt because one man raped. So it was very wild. Women were punished very harshly if they ever went against the word of their man. Like, there's also articles, I remember while writing about it, like if a woman would hurt a man's testicle, like her arms would be broken or her eyes would be gouged out. If he hurt both testicles, her both eyes were gouged out. Like, it didn't matter if it's self-defense. So Assyria was not a good place to be a woman at the late and middle stages. And do you want to add something?
No.
Like we can
move on to
we can move on to Egypt.
That's nice.
Oh, this is nicer. Now, ancient Egypt may be the most pleasant place for women to live in the Antiquity. So we have a civilization that was very mild, and where we practically have almost like this full equality of men and women. Almost. There were some limitations, but women had like their full legal capacity. They could own property. They can go to be parties in litigations, they can be witnesses, they can get married on their own, they can have a divorce on their own. When we're talking about divorce, 1/3 of property in cases of divorce went to a woman, which is presumed to be her dowry, 2/3 went to a man. And Egyptians were known for having these lovely statues of married couples. The husband would hold a wife and she would put her hand on his chest. And Professor Voyle loves to say that he read somewhere that a statue was found. Apparently, the couple went through a divorce and the husband's hand was hacked away from his wife, so they were not in love anymore. Egypt had a very interesting mythology, and what's very typical for Egyptian society is that everything that existed in mythology Egyptians deemed as acceptable in real life. And Egyptian mythology is filled with very strong female characters and goddesses that were of utmost importance for Egypt and its existence and its creation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, just going to mention Isis, who was a very important role in Egyptian mythology as a wife, dedicated wife who saved her husband and resurrected him from the dead, and also as a dedicated mother to Horus. She also saved his life. And Horus is very important because the pharaohs saw themselves as personification of the god of sun, Horus, right? Also, we have the goddess Ma'at, who is also very important. Ma'at represented this cosmical justice and cosmic law that existed, balance that existed for both gods and humans, and it was the pharaoh's role to protect that balance. And that cosmic balance and law was represented in a female goddess. So females played a very important part in Egyptian mythology, and therefore it was quite acceptable for Egyptian to allow women to have a very important role in their society. Women held high functions as well. They were visible also as pharaohs. They could practically do any profession they desired. And I'm just gonna, for a moment, talk about the pharaohs, which is interesting, and that's the moment where we can see that when women overstepped the traditional roles that were given to them, that were allowed them to have in civilization, they faced a pushback from the society. So what am I talking about? You all know, you're all familiar most definitely that Egypt was famous for its female rulers. So there were also Hatshepsut, maybe the most famous one, Nefertiti, Cleopatra, etc., etc. But when researching the sources, it is noticeable that when women were enthroned, there was a certain, as I said, pushback from the society that was not a role for women that was so open-handedly accepted in Egyptian society. Now, a woman is very much valuable as a mother, as a daughter, as pharaoh's consort. Role of royal Egyptian women was extremely important. In order for you to become a pharaoh, you had to marry a pharaoh's daughter. In order for your sons to be legitimate heirs, you have to have a pharaoh's daughter for a wife. So she's inevitable. You cannot avoid her. But she's overstepping her role when entering the role of a pharaoh. It's traditionally connected to men. Even when you look at Egyptian mythology, all the rulers are usually men. So we have several Egyptian rulers. Merneid, for example, she was the first female regent. She's not mentioned at all in royal archives. Now, was it on purpose? Was it by accident? Was she just not deemed as too worthy? We don't know. There's also a list of other female rulers. Hatshepsut may be the most famous one, who, when they entered the role of the pharaoh, they tried very hard to present themselves as males. Now, not because, they knew they were females, they saw themselves as females, but holding power was connected with being male. So they would wear a fake beard, they were dressed in men's clothes, they would wear all the regalia that male pharaohs wore.
They would speak of themselves using the male gender grammatically.
Kings, yes, and male gender. And even then they faced backlash. That Hatshepsut, for example, the ruler who came after her, he tried very hard to remove all the mentions and representations of her in the hieroglyphs. That's what I wanted to say. I lost my train of thought.
Well, while you gather your thoughts, just an idea generally, since Una made this distinction, there's a very unpleasant line in modern historiography to insert today's attitudes into historical events.
Yeah.
And for example, when they see women representing themselves as masculine in some way, they say, oh, that was a transgender woman, and things like that. So please be very wary of such texts, of such opinions, because we have to look at historical sources from the perspective when they were created. So in this case, it's the question of a social role. So it was socially, traditionally, and Egyptians are very, very traditional. Ancient societies generally are, but Egyptians particularly so. It was traditionally acceptable for the pharaoh to be male, and then when a woman takes the throne, she simply goes with the tradition and wears all the male clothing and speaks of herself as a king and not a queen, because we know what a queen is. A queen is a king's spouse. She's not a ruler in her own, and we have such cases even in the Middle Ages, and Queen Elizabeth in England, and so on and so forth. So, Professor Dagica.
Just a short question. When you speak about that, comparatively speaking, much better life conditions and the position of women in the ancient Egypt, I think you should be cautious and take into consideration what I think that is on agenda, that you're speaking mostly about the higher classes, female members, not generally. So generalization of the much better position of women in the ancient Egypt, I think it should have been taken more cautiously.
Generally, yes. So generally, when we're talking about pre-modern societies, be they ancient or medieval, there is always a very distinct structure of classes or even estates as legally established classes with different rights. And naturally, it is better to be in a higher class than a lower one, and it is in average better to be male than to be female. So of course that a noble woman would be in a much better position than a poor farmer's wife. But in Egypt, generally, even among the lower classes, we have relative equality. So we have, for example, from Deir el Medina, there are many papyri preserved speaking of the workers' life there and so on, of ordinary women. We see a very, very corrupt construction foreman being fired for various misdeeds, and one of them is sexual assault against one of the women working there. So there are some bits of evidence, even in the lower classes, that Egypt was generally a fairly egalitarian society by the standards of that time. It would be relatively patriarchal by today's standards, but the thousands of years that have passed in between are simply a testament that it did not have to be very discriminatory even in that age. Sorry.
No, I think we should, yes. Yeah. Ancient Jewish law. I'm very sorry that Professor Voya is not here because this is his field of research. I'm just gonna try to present basic facts about it, and then we will move on to, as I'm not much of an expert in ancient Jewish law. So we're talking about women in Old Testament. So women in old Jewish societies were faced with a very patriarchal and very traditional system of values that put men above women, and they put men's honor above women's life. And there are many representations in the Bible, quite graphic, where women were offered to be sexually assaulted in order to preserve a life of a man, not getting into too many details. So women were seen again on the one side as being below men, and that also stems from this myth of Eve and how the first woman is sinful and every woman therefore is also sinful. There is again this motive of women being easily corrupted, easily tempted, prone to sin, and also quite good at making other people's sin as well. There is this famous story of King David who fell in love with another man's wife. She seduced him. So he was so bewitched by her that he decided to send her husband away to war so he can get killed, so that David could marry his wife. So there's this, often there we have this moment of women corrupting the men. So the Testament says to men, be wary and stay away from other wives and other women who are not yours. The Old Testament is filled with mixed feelings towards women. As I already mentioned, how they saw women on the one side, and the position of women in all Jewish society was not only determined by their sex. There is difference of treatment women depending on the role they had in the society. Were they someone's daughter, or someone's wife, or someone's mother, or someone's concubine, or a slave? Different standards were applied to women of who had different roles in the society. On the other hand, Jewish society still recognized that women were an integral part of the society, and without a woman, you did not have a family. Without family, you did not have heirs, which were extremely important. But when we talk about heirs, again, sons were much preferred more than daughters, and they were placed above daughters, especially the eldest son, as he was seen as this heir of not only material goods, but also spiritual goods and inheritance from his fathers. Just in short, women did have limited legal capacity. Professor Voya usually says that it is better than Athens, but it's not difficult to be better than Athens. They could conclude contracts with approval from their husbands and fathers, and it seems that divorced or widowed wives had full legal capacity. But again, it was a very patriarchal society, and just I will remind you to what we mentioned at the beginning. In Jewish society, we had Levirate marriages where when husband dies, his wife was supposed to get married to her husband's brother, and there was an obligation. It was not an option, it was an obligation. So
and that's again, so they'd preserve the connection between the families, because that's very important. It's not about the feelings of a particular married couple. It's not about her late husband's brother being in love with her or anything of that sort. It's simply the families have to stay in kinship, particularly if the couple hasn't had children yet. If they have children, generally that already created a connection between the families. But if it happened, for example, that the young husband died in war briefly after they married and there were no children, she has to marry another man from the family, ideally his brother, so the families would stay connected, and so they would have joint offspring.
Just final sentence about this ancient Jewish law, as we say here, from Eve to Deborah. Like, as I said, very mixed feelings towards women. On the one hand, we have Eve as a representation of sin and how women are sinful, but we have to mention that the Old Testament still mentions some very strong female characters. So it's not just the bad representation of women. We have also very strong female characters where they're very fearless when slaying their enemies or helping the fugitives to hide who were persecuted unjustly. And as we mentioned, Deborah was maybe one of the most important women in the Bible, as she was given the role of a judge, which means that she was highly valued for her wisdom and virtue, etc., etc. So let's just jump to Greece. I'm going to try to be brief here. When we talk about Greece, that is also a civilization that we cannot treat as a monolith, as every polis had its own law system. There were some similarities, but there were also differences, and therefore we always separate like three different polis: Sparta, Gortyn, and Athens. Now, in literature, there is a small not disagreement, but I feel that some writers think that Sparta was better for women, some think that Gortyn was better for women. No one thinks that Athens was better for women. I think personally, I don't want to say my subjective opinions, but let's just say the facts. When it comes to Gortyn, women had limited legal capacity. They were allowed to own property, but only movable property, not land, not houses. And when they inherited movable property, it was 2 times less than their brothers. So again, we have this slight discrimination. But women could conclude contracts in regards of that property. They can go to court. They can be witnesses, they could divorce. So it wasn't really that bad, to say in short. We had this institution of a daughter heiress, but I'm going to come back to it in the end. Just keep it in mind for a moment. When we're talking about Sparta, it's usually in literature stated that Spartan women had it good because at some point they gained the ability to become owners of property. But I would just like to remind everyone that that ability came in the 4th century before Christ. Sparta exists from the 9th century. So there are 5 centuries of women not being able to own property before they were able to. And also it's emphasized that Spartan women were well educated as well, and they were certainly better positioned than Athenian women. But when you take into consideration the whole Spartan culture, it was very military oriented, and the value of women was determined by what she can contribute to the polis. So women were valued only as mothers. Their only goal was to give birth to healthy baby boys, not girls. Girls were not preferred. So that Sparta can build an army of soldiers. So women, if even they survived their infancy, if they were not deemed as excessive to the society, they had a very harsh life, in my opinion, I think from a modern perspective at least, so I have to make that kind of part about. So she was, from very young age, also, she went through rigorous physical exercises and trainings just as boys, her hair cut short. There was this story, now this isn't checked if it's correct, that when their time came for them to get married, the boys and girls would be placed in one dark room, and who caught who, that was your spouse. Now, I think this is a bit of a stretch coming from ancient Greeks.
The point with Sparta is that it was a very closed society, not very literate, so we don't have many native Spartan sources, and what we have coming from writers from other polis always has to be taken with a grain of salt, because foreigners weren't welcome in Sparta, so how did these writers know? A lot of it was probably hearsay or enhancing the story to be interesting to listeners in Athens, same as Herodotus writing on Egypt, because he was so shocked on the equality there that he says it was everything the other way around, like women go to war and men don't, daughters have to take care of their aged parents but sons don't have to, etc. That is of course not true, but that's always sensationalist writing in the Antiquity.
And also in Sparta there is this huge separation between genders, like women were at home and men were completely dedicated to war and to training. They dined together, slept together, lived together. Men in their military camps, they would sneak in at night to visit their wives and bed their wives so they can produce heirs, and then in the morning they would sneak back to the military camp. So there is this massive separation of genders there. Women's only task is to give birth to healthy male heirs, which is also seen in this possibility for women to commit adultery. That is always mentioned as something good and beneficial for women, but it really was not introduced to give women, a wild life of pleasures, but because they wanted to enable women to give birth to as many healthy baby boys as possible. The adultery was allowed because the idea was, okay, it's allowed if a wife cheats on her husband with a stronger, healthier Spartan man, because then their offsprings are going to be healthy and strong. That's the reasoning behind the adultery.
That's the standard, the male ideal in Sparta. Of course, it's going to be a stronger man, a better warrior, etc., etc.
And also, as a woman, you had to let go of your son at the age of 7. So he's sent away to these military camps. You don't see him again. You're supposed to send away your husband and your sons to war by saying you either be victorious or come back dead. I mean, it's a harsh environment. So I wouldn't say it's the best place for women, but again, at least they could own property from 4th century onwards. Again, they also had the daughter heiress. I'm going to get back to her again in the end. And now we came to Athens. Now, Athens was probably the most developed Greek polis in regards to politics and science and philosophy, but one thing they were bad at was treatment of women. Now, it may be, I think I can feel it.
Treatment of everyone who is not the upper male citizen class.
Exactly that. So their view of women was very hypocritical. I'm going to try to be very fast here. So women did not have pretty much any legal capacity, and little rights they did have, and I'm talking about citizen women. I need to emphasize that. The little rights they had, they could not enforce them, but another man in their life had to enforce their rights for them. So they did not have any legal capacity. Their only role was to stay home, be a good housewife, and give birth to children. And Athenian men saw women. So what was an ideal woman to Athenian man? She was quiet. She was obedient. She did not bother to get educated. And I mean, she was not allowed to get educated because education would corrupt her. She was innocent, and she was fully dedicated to her house and to her children. She did not speak against her husband. She was very timid. And of course, she was invisible to the public eye. So no political rights, no women in public spaces. They even had magistrates in Athens, gynekonomoi, who would go around the palace and just observe women and make notes if they were behaving properly. If women spent too much time outside of their house, and it's not in order to maintain their household or to visit theater or to go to religious ceremonies, she would be considered as immoral. So she's closed off in the house. So the women in nature, Athenians see them again, we have the same motive. They're easily corrupted, they're stupid, they're easily tempted, and therefore they need to be under control. That's why Athenian women were, by the age of 14 when they got married, under strict control of their family, and then they would get married off, and they were under strict control of their husband.
And the husband is probably usually much older.
Much older. So the age for marriage for men was around 30. For girls was 14. And as I said, education was not allowed for Athenian women because it was thought that it would corrupt them, spoil them. So on the other hand, we had another set of women in Polis, and those were usually Metic women, meaning that those were foreign women who came to Athens to permanently reside there. Now, those women did not act as ideal Athenian women. They had more liberties than Athenian citizen women. They could even own property. They had a certain amount of legal capacity, and they were known for being usually very educated and very wealthy, especially the heteras, the let's call it elite prostitutes in a sort of way. I mean, I think they are labeled as elite prostitutes. I do see them as just simply foreign women who gained wealth and education and just labeled as prostitutes.
Let's say they were elite companions to men. There could be sexual intercourse involved, but not necessarily. They're closer to geishas than to prostitutes.
Yes, exactly. Geishas is a good comparison. So Athenian men loved the company of heteras and generally Metic women because they were available to them. They could have a conversation with them. They can, be companions to each other. Heteras were welcomed in these symposiums, these feasts of Greek men where they talked about philosophy, history, and everything. So they enjoyed their company, but at the same time, they were labeled as immoral. And there is a mention in sources that Metic women are the biggest destabilizers of Athenian Republic because they are dragging the men away from their families. And they were often prosecuted for very serious made-up crimes, usually as blasphemy, etc. So we have this very hypocritical approach to women in Athens, right? So again, to end Greece with the daughter Eris that existed in practically all the polis. The daughter Eris gives a fake impression that women could become heiresses. They could not. It's just the name given to a daughter. So the biggest fear of a Greek man is that he will not have heirs, male heirs, biological or adopted. So in case a Greek man did not have a male heir, and he only had the sons, yes, and he only has daughters, the daughter would become daughter heiress. Patroiokos in Gortyn, Patrouchos in Sparta, Epikleros in Greece. The meaning of the words basically means the one that comes with the property. So she did not inherit her father's property. She would just be the keeper of it. And her only role was to marry the closest male kin on her father's side, produce an heir from that marriage, son, and that son would inherit all the property. She was just a vessel to transfer property from her father to her son. And there is a difference between the polis in Gortin, for example. Gortin, daughter heiress, had some wiggle room to choose whom she's gonna marry from the list of kin, but she never became the owner of the property that came to her. She never was the owner of the property. Spartan daughter heiress also had a little bit of wiggle room. She could choose from the list of relatives who to marry, and from 4th century onward, she became the owner of the property. So that's the best position of daughter heiress in Greece. Athenian daughter heiress could not choose whom she marries. So if an old uncle is first on the list and he's living, she has to marry the old uncle. So she has to follow the line, and she never also became the owner of the property. And to make it even more absurd, there was this, it was not absurd from their point of view. There was this obligation of her husband to have intercourse with her at least 3 times per month, because they had to produce heirs. And if he did not perform this marital duty, either she or nosy neighbors could report him to the magistrate, so the magistrate can scold him for not performing his duties. So I'm just going to end about Athens, Greece, with that.
Just to add something that the listeners might not know, yes, of course, this had the dimension of inheriting the property. But what was important to those families in Greece and elsewhere was also the transfer of the religious duties that came with the family cult. So the head of the family, traditionally a man, was also the chief priest in the family, so to speak. So the one who was in charge of all the religious duties towards the household gods and the spirits of their ancestors. So it was considered that only a man, a son, could inherit that sort of duty. And then this religious obligation also made it very important for men to have male heirs. It was similar in Rome, if you remember all the duties of the pater familias, and we're getting to Rome. And Romans also had the wording filia familia sua finis. A daughter is the end of her family, because her children will be her husband's children and not her father's. But they did not have such an institution, except maybe somewhere in the time of Romulus.
Probably, yeah. And now we are Rome. Feel free to jump in Rome.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, in Rome, we again see, as Professor wrote, there is not an ideal image, an image of ideal woman in Rome, because the woman was different depending on classes she belonged to, of course. There was this idea, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that again, a woman was kind of protector of the family's morality and virtue, or her man's morality and virtue. And there are often stories in mythology and history where women would commit suicide in order to preserve their honor and the honor of their husbands and their fathers. So that's a motive that kind of repeats itself. The history of women in Rome is like the slow emancipation both within the family and also in public spaces. And I just have 2 short examples, but you can fill me in if you know any more. How marriage changed in Roman law. And first and typical form of marriage was a marriage cum manu, which basically means that the woman was under the full control of her husband. If she had any property before that marriage, it became her husband's property, and she's seen in the family as the daughter of her husband. And eventually in 2nd century BC, there was another type of marriage, sine manu, which was more favorable to women and preferable, because a woman, when she would marry her husband, she would still be considered to belong to her father. So her property did not become her father's property, and she would become sui juris sooner, which means in its own right, when her father died, she would become sui juris, while here in marriage cum manu, she would become sui juris only in case of widowhood and divorce. So that's one short example that I've just prepared for change in the family law. As for the public changes, I just have one interesting example. Professor Voya mentioned that. I didn't know these facts, honestly, about it. I know about Lex Oppia, the famous law that limited luxury for women. So women were banned for wearing excessive jewelry because of economic crisis, and women shouldn't, parade their jewelry. Cato the Elder said, Roman women were already corrupted by luxury and acting as wild animals who have once tasted blood, in the sense they can no longer trust to restrain themselves from rushing into an orgy of extravagance. And that's why women should be banned from wearing this excessive jewelry. And we have this interesting moment where matrons and women of Rome were so outraged by this that they stormed the Capitol. They blocked the streets, they blocked access to forums, and they pestered the tribunes days in, days out. And they've managed to win this battle, and Lex Oppia was not enforced anymore. But that's, I think, their step into the public light, and they managed to fight for their rights indirectly, not in the forums by speaking, but this pressure that was put on tribunes from the side.
If I may
Yes.
add a parallel between Greece and Rome regarding sexual morality, because there were some things mentioned in the slides, but we didn't focus on it. Generally, when we speak of sexual crimes, we mean on the one hand violent sexual crimes, first of all rape, and we are aware that in these periods of history, adultery, at least adultery by women, was considered a crime. But in Greece and Rome, it was actually a little broader. In Greece, there was a crime called moicheia, at least in Athens, which we usually translate as adultery. But it's not quite. Adultery would be a married woman having sexual intercourse, or at least a romantic escapade with someone other than her husband. But this moicheia includes any woman under that man's power as head of the family, so that could also be his unmarried daughter or sister or his widowed mother. So a single woman, unmarried or divorced or widowed, was also prescribed from having any sort of romantic or sexual relationship with some man, unless she was married, while there were naturally no such distinctions for men. And in Rome, there was a similar crime called stuprum, which is later translated as fornication, because that's what it was used for in the Middle Ages as a Christian term. But again, that includes having sexual intercourse with a woman under another's power, or a young boy as well. And the perpetrator is generally the man. So it's the man who is the evil adulterer, let's say, who seduces some woman or some young boy who can't think for himself properly. He's not a man yet. And that was generally considered a very severe crime. And there's an often quoted and sometimes misquoted part from Lysias, I think, where he says that in Athens, the legislator believes that moicheia, so let's say adultery, is a worse crime than rape, because a rapist only takes away your wife from you briefly during the act and that's it, no harm done, so to speak. And while an adulterer corrupts her, he seduces her, he corrupts her mind away from her husband, and he puts into question whose the children are. And this was relatively similar in Rome as well, not as extreme as in Athens, but generally the views on sexual morality were similar. Now, we might know Rome and Greece, and particularly Greece, as a country where homosexuality was generally socially accepted. Yes, but that more included an emotional connection between usually an older man and his young lover, and God's forbid that there be actual full sexual intercourse, because then that boy renounces his rights as a citizen. He puts himself in the same league as slave boys or foreign men who frequently were prostitutes in Athens, etc. So generally in the Antiquity, we see homosexuality is not wrong per se, but a man playing the passive role in homosexual intercourse is terribly wrong, and he renounces his rights as a man in such a case.
We can end with the Antiquity. I mean, that is right. Yeah, can move to Middle Ages. So.
Okay, so we're not going to make a break after the first class. We'll do it as most other teachers have done. Yes, of course. Are there any comments and questions regarding the Antiquity? Because we're about to move on to the Middle Ages, and feel free to add anything that you want at any
observations, comments, anything.
Okay, then we're just moving on to the medieval presentation, which is going to